Well, thank you very much, President Mason. Always great to be here. I am the son of a John Jay alum. My dad, the late Edward J. Louis, was NYPD officer who went here under a program that allowed cops to go here for free. And he did it while working full-time for the NYPD. And it took a long time, but he did end up getting a bachelor's degree. I'm glad to be here in part because this is a question that we have been talking about at Spectrum News NY1 for quite a while, and in trying to both cover the news side of it, but also provide some analysis and some context to watch the narrative depart from the factual basis that we all hope it would rest on, has been a challenge professionally and personally a little frustrating. You know, I mean, you spend a lot of time reading through reports from places like John Jay and trying to make sure that you have the numbers right and the facts right and the trends right and the percentages right, only to hear people, some in positions of political authority, say, well, none of that matters. Let's just use common sense, right? Let's depart from the facts and just, you know, do stuff to people. It all reminds me, Senator, of a phrase that was very much in the headlines in the late 1980s called preventive detention, which is really what some people are calling for, which is very different from what you all had in mind. So let me just start by invoking the frequently quoted and misquoted, I'm probably misquoting it too, it's often attributed to Otto von Bismarck: if you like laws and sausages, you should never watch either one being made. But as one of the top chefs in the sausage factory, I would like to talk to you for a little bit about how this all came about, you know, because among the things that are now departing from the facts is the chronology, the history, the legislative intent, I guess you would call it. Take us back to 2019. This is before George Floyd. This is before the nationwide protests. This was on the agenda. This was something the legislature was taking up and working on quite diligently, along with some other jurisdictions around the country. What was the intent? Why was this on the agenda? What made 2019 in particular a propitious or politically viable or attractive year to try and move this legislation forward?
Okay, thank you. And let me just take a moment to thank also President Carol Mason and Jeremy Travis for getting us together today, and you, Errol, for continuing to do the great job you do. I didn't go to school here, but I went to school right across the street at the Lincoln Center campus for Fordham, so it's a familiar neighborhood for me as well. As to your question, I'm going to take you back further than 2019. 2015 is when I introduced the bill to enact bail reform. Now, we were in the minority then, so it didn't have a lot of chance of passage, but 2019 was a momentous year in the state. We took the state Senate. We had two functioning houses that were passing laws of great import on so many issues. Most people today are most pleased with the fact that we codified Roe versus Wade in January of 2019, our first few weeks in the majority, and that is proving to be prescient, but we're not here to talk about that today. But the other thing that happened in 2015, which is why that bill got introduced, was a young man who spent years in Rikers Island unjustly killed himself, and that was Khalif Browder. Very high-profile case, but a case that is representative of hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands, of more people that entered the system. And we were committed to doing something to bring about justice. And then you take the 10,000-foot level thought about it, and like, what is bail? By definition, bail discriminates against the poor. You're asking people to pay for their freedom. And you don't hear any complaints about wealthy, awful people who do awful things in our home because they have enough money to be home. You know, I was reading last year, the year before, I forget when it was, but I guess we're in the pandemic, maybe it was the year before that Harvey Weinstein was like at comedy clubs and out at restaurants. And why? Because he had enough money to pay bail while he's waiting for his trial and all the awful things he's accused of doing. Of course, young, poor people, primarily of color in this city, don't have that ability. And one of the things I had done, I've always been interested in criminal justice issues, and I've worked on wrongful convictions and other issues over the years. I've been in public service, but I also had volunteered with the Fortune Society to mentor people who were incarcerated at Rikers and try and help them integrate into the community once they come out. And it was eye-opening just to talk to these people and get their perspective. It's such a different perspective than you and I would have. Because I was asking one of the gentlemen I was dealing with, I said, well, why, what happened to you? And he had bail set at some incredibly low number. It might have been like $500 or something, low for you and I. And he's like, I just never had a thought that I could round up that kind of money. So he's like, I'm here. And I just knew I was going to be here. And oftentimes, especially on low-level charges, these people are held at Rikers for longer than their sentences would be if they are actually convicted after trial. And the injustice in that is obvious, or should be obvious to everyone, especially in a system that we're taught from when we're children. We take great pride in the American system of justice, innocent unless proven guilty. These are all pretrial incarcerations we're talking about. These are people who are denied their freedom before they're convicted because they don't have enough money to pay for their freedom while they're waiting for their day in court. So if someone wants to defend that system, I'll have at it all day, every day with them, because that is unjust in so many ways. And then, of course, we set about trying to fix that. And the reforms of 2019, subsequently amended in 2020, and again this year, are our best effort to do that.
In New York, famously, the law specifies that bail can only be set in such a manner or according to factors that deal with whether or not the person will show up for trial. That immediately became sort of the touchstone of the opposition, as far as I can tell. What was that conversation like? Because, essentially what we have had, and this goes all the way back to the fights when they would attack former Judge Bruce Wright and others, softy judge that let this guy out, that sort of a thing, where it became clear along the way that some people did not see bail for what it was legislatively intended for, but basically as a sort of a tool to hold people that, for whatever reason, they thought should be preventively detained.
That's 100% correct. And bail in New York has never been used to, or the pretrial system, I should say, has never been used to make a judgment about whether someone is dangerous. And you hear about this dangerousness standard all over. But in New York, that was never in place. And so rewind 10 years, 15 years, everyone was so happy with how safe things were. We did not have a dangerousness standard in New York, so we know how to make the system work without that. Because, of course, the problem when you start evaluating that, a criminal trial is our system for evaluating whether someone committed the crime they're accused of. When you start evaluating whether someone is dangerous, when a judge and a prosecutor are evaluating whether someone is dangerous before they've even been adjudicated, the consequences, as data will show, have a horrible impact on particular classes of people, typically young people of color, again, who always seem to be getting the short end in our system. And it is not something that we need, we ever had, or actually makes us safer.
Is New York unique in its adherence to that standard of, only to ensure appearance at trial and essentially no other reason?
Yes, in a word, yes. I mean, we are maybe one of the few, if not the only state that does not consider that.
Yeah. When you began drafting legislation in that period, 2015 up to 2019, was there serious consideration in the legislature about doing away with that standard, about bringing New York in line with the other 49 states?
It has the reform conversation, the legislation took a lot of different forms over the years, and a lot of different ideas were explored. The original draft of the bill eliminated bail for everything across the board, take money out of the system entirely, and it wasn't a dangerousness standard, but it did have some mechanism for determining when remand was appropriate, not based on theoretical dangerousness, which to me sounds like, the pre-crime evaluators in the Minority Report, right? Like there's obvious problems with trying to predict when someone's going to do something when they haven't actually done it. But for me, the dangerousness standard is a problem and always was a problem, and it's a problem in the states that have it. Some places now say they have algorithms to make proper determinations, but then you could, you could dig into this 7 different ways. At the end of the day, what tends to happen is the same people who are always getting screwed by the system end up getting screwed by any type of predictive model as to whether or not they're going to be dangerous on the street. And yes, for every New York Post headline about someone who did something awful or is accused of doing something awful, there's dozens of more who have more stable lives because of what we've done, who are home with their families, who get to keep their jobs while they're going through the system. And that ultimately makes us all safer, which is another part of this that really gets at me. It does not help anybody. It doesn't help the people, certainly, who are incarcerated. It doesn't help our communities in general to take somebody, put them in Rikers for several months or a year or however long they're waiting for their trial, and then release them back out into the community. What's happened in the meantime is they've lost hope. They've lost their families, they've lost their jobs, they've lost their school opportunities, and then you're throwing them back onto the streets without any ability to provide for themselves. And then you're more likely to have them commit additional crimes or do things they shouldn't be doing. So none of this makes sense to me, and ultimately I don't want to filibuster, I want to let you get in with your question, but what has become clear to me over the last couple of years is there is just our legal system is adversarial. Each side makes its case. Prosecutors are not supposed to be in an adversarial posture. They're supposed to do justice, whether by acquittal or conviction. But in fact, they're adversarial. And they sit there and they count how many people they put in jail, and they think that's a good thing. And usually they're in league with the law enforcement. And they are defending their turf, so to speak. And their turf is, we want more people in jail, and we want to keep people off the streets who they might deem are unsafe.
Was that the process as you were drafting the legislation? I know there were, lots of hearings, lots of people who weigh in, the lobbyists, have your phone number. The DAs, I imagine, weighed in, maybe the sheriffs, a lot of other law enforcement?
And I don't want to paint with too broad a brush. There were some DAs who were very productive in terms of the suggestions they made and were genuinely interested in getting us to a good conclusion. But writ large, the law enforcement lobby, so to speak, and look, they're very effective. They're the reason we're standing here today talking about why this issue has been so misunderstood, is between them and the editorial boards. They just are relentless. And what's happened is, because crime has gone up, not at all related to bail reform, by the way, because it has gone up in every city and every state in this country over the last couple of years due to a variety of factors. And we're the only state that did this bail reform. So I don't know why Chicago or LA or these other cities are experiencing similar crime spikes because we did bail reform. Obviously, it's not directly related to that. But the people that don't like what we did are using it very effectively to completely mischaracterize the law.
The part of the legislative process is that if, for whatever reason, even if you don't like the reason, if you don't respect the reason, if it's based on something other than the facts as you understand them, compromise is how the system works, right? So there were the 2020 amendments to the package that you originally got passed, and I wanted to drill down on a particular phrase. It makes people eligible for bail if both a current and a pending charge involve, quote, harm to an identifiable person or property. What's the origin of putting that in as an amendment? What was the fight about there?
Yeah, and you're right. The sausage making on this, as with most laws, it takes you in directions you may not have originally intended. I mentioned the original bill got rid of bail in every instance and replaced it with a different process. What we ended up with was something that mostly got rid of bail for certain categories of charges, and we started calling it the bail bucket in terms of the negotiation. And then the 2020 amendments were primarily about adding additional charges to the bail bucket. One of the things we did, because we constantly are trying to listen and actually accept good ideas and make changes when necessary, is this idea of repeat offenders, people who just cycle through because they're not being held, are just committing the same, or accused of committing the same crimes over and over again. And so the idea was, if you're out on a charge and you're pending trial and you're charged yet again with something that would be harmful to a person or property, that you can then be bail eligible. Interestingly, that those words, we thought we knew what they meant, but judges kind of looked at it differently. And so I think we had always, in those 2020 amendments, intended to capture like the person who keeps, robbing banks day after day while they're out. But it was not harm to property was not interpreted to include stealing property, and so the changes we made this year clarified that.
Mm. And the clarification says what? That it's in effect, at least the way the judges are interpreting it, it's capturing a lot of misdemeanors, right? Repeat misdemeanors.
Yeah, but only certain kinds of misdemeanors, right? First of all, we never go below a misdemeanor because the actual maximum sentence after conviction of a B misdemeanor lower is less time than you'd get waiting for your trial at Rikers. So none of those are in the categories we're talking about. But what we did in this year was we defined harm the way we intended it to be defined. So we made it clear that theft of property is included in these repeat offenses that would be bail eligible.
At the time that the main body of legislation was being done, the governor at the time, Andrew Cuomo, weighed in. The mayor at the time, Bill de Blasio, weighed in. That's where, in my memory, serious talk about adding, fundamentally changing the law and putting in a dangerousness standard started to be heard. Were they, I don't want to use the word posturing, but were they sort of just announcing a position, or were they serious about trying to persuade you to fundamentally change the way New York does bail?
It's a good question. The mayor had his position, but didn't really influence the conversation very much. This was, as we discussed, this is something that had been getting discussed and thought about for years. And yes, I think former Chief Judge Littman had a whole report that also advocated for dangerousness. This dangerousness question has been raging long before we've started having this conversation. It has been a subject of serious debate in New York policy for a long time, and it had been settled decades ago that we weren't doing that. And then in the effort to reform the injustices of bail, I think people who had that point of view saw it as an opening to reintroduce that as part of the discussion. In the end, Andrew Cuomo signed, obviously, what we came up with, and so he didn't hang on to that position terribly strongly. But the mayor, this is a statewide policy. The mayor is always an important person, important local leader, but I think many mayors have been frustrated by their lack of the influence they would like over state laws, and so I don't know that the Mayor de Blasio was terribly influential one way or the other.
The Khalif Browder case that you mentioned is one of the sort of the founding issues that led to some of the reform efforts. There were a lot of different problems there. There was also a speedy trial problem, for sure. In one of the early versions of the legislation, you included maximum detention time limits. It would have been 120 days for people charged with a felony, 30 days for a misdemeanor, very aggressive schedule. I'm looking here, and it says as of May 5th of this year, people at Rikers before trial had been in jail for an average of 325 days. Why did the maximum detention time limits, even something less aggressive than 120 days, why did that fall out of the legislation?
Because of the sausage making is the short answer. Look, speedy trials or speedier trials would solve a lot of the problem we're discussing. The fact that people have to wait almost a year on average at Rikers Island for their trial is a big part of the problem. If the detention we're talking about was a few weeks before your trial, that's a very different conversation than people who, Khalif Browder, 3 years, right, at Rikers in the extreme cases. But the system doesn't have the resources, is not geared up to handle things that quickly, particularly now with the pandemic having shut the courts down for so long. They're still catching up, from what I gather. But even in 2019, some thought that those were impractical time limits.
You've done some, the legislature has done some discovery reform. The mayor has expressed publicly a great deal of frustration with other elements of the system, including the courts, and whether or not they're moving cases quickly enough. Is that an area for future conversation about reform? Is that something you're looking at?
Well, we enacted discovery reform as part of the criminal justice package in 2019. We amended it just this past year, but there's an example, a good news story is all sides agreed on the changes we made this year, and so both the prosecutorial and defense bars, we're happy with what we ended up with. And that's ultimately, look, legislation works best when it's done that way. You do something, you find out what people like or don't like about it, and you make changes that make sense. On bail, we can't agree on having an honest conversation about it, and that's the problem. And you have circumstances where, as we speak, crime is a concern in New York City, obviously, for so many of us, and people are, in our line of work, are always finger pointing and trying to avoid getting tagged with it. Mayor Adams is out there, just yesterday, I think, trying to make sure he's not getting blamed for not doing anything about it. So he's blaming Albany, he's blaming guns, he's blaming, and there may be elements of truth in all of it, but everyone is pointing at bail in a way that is so frustrating. There was a story just a few days ago in Rochester, the Monroe County Sheriff, I think it was, and the headline and the entire story made absolutely no sense. It says, "Sheriff blames parole bail reform for increasing crime." I don't even understand what those words mean all put together. Like, if you're out on parole, you're not in a pretrial bail situation. By the way, if you're out on parole, no matter what you do, you're bail eligible if you're charged with something else. But it's just become the thing that everyone throws the mud at to get it away from themselves. Why is the clearance rate so low? Someone should ask that sheriff. Why are they only solving a certain percentage of crimes in New York City? It's a very low number. 30% of crimes are solved. That startled me when I learned about it. That means if you're wanting to do something you shouldn't be doing, if you want to break the law, you got a 70% chance of getting away with it. That seems to me to be much more a factor in people's minds than whether they may or may not have to put down some money, if they may or may not have, to avoid a few months in Rikers while they're waiting to actually get convicted or not. Like, I don't know that someone who's thinking about committing a crime is calculating all that so much as, I might get away with it. That's the bigger factor to me.
Right. Well, in our last few minutes, I mean, there are the facts that we're going to hear about later in the conference today, and this being a institution of higher learning that has top researchers and can sort of crunch the numbers up, down, and sideways. We'll get to the bottom of that. But you're in a world where there are political facts, right, in an election year. And if the political fact is that voters are concerned about rising crime and are going to punish at the polls anybody who doesn't sort of do something about it, it sort of creates facts on the ground. It creates a governor who says, we've gone too far, whatever that means, and we've got to make some changes. It creates legislators, I'm sure people in your conference who are saying, look, I got to say something, I got to do something, I can't sign on to this. What does that mean for the existing reforms and whether or not their intended effect on the system is going to be cut back or continue?
Well, look, we've now had 2 rounds of this subsequent fight from the 2019 reforms, and we have drawn a hard line. There was a problem we all identified. Even our opponents on this issue agreed that there were problems with the system that has existed in 2019. We are committed never to do anything to take us backwards from there, and that's why this dangerousness question keeps coming up. Imposing a dangerousness standard when we've never had one, that would be like rewind to 2019 and go backwards in time to make things more regressive instead of more reform-oriented. So to the extent people want to keep having that conversation, they can. They bludgeoned us with it in 2020 in our campaigns. Ron Lauder spent $5 million trying to beat up our candidates. The PBA in New York City spent $1 million in Nassau County in a race to try and beat us, and we came back with a supermajority. So obviously it's a different political climate now. We could talk about redistricting another time, but we don't know what our lines are going to be just yet. We'll do our best to make our cases. We always do, but that's our system. That's democracy. I think money is too influential in our democracy, but nonetheless, we fight the fights, and we've been pretty successful in the Senate with a lot of opponents over the years.
What would you say to the many, well, there's a combination of scholars and students and activists and other people who have some influence and want to be part of this conversation going forward? What would you urge them to do to become part of this?
Well, there's a number of organizations that are involved on this issue, and I'm sure John Jay can point people to the right ones, but we have, and I don't want to pick individual ones I would direct people to because there's so many good ones, but if someone wants to reach out, we can, and I'm sure John Jay could do this too, point them to any of the multitude of advocacy groups that are working on this and other issues. But there's not a dearth of them. There's lots of them.
one way to interpret all of this, I wonder why I never hear, or I haven't heard more from you and some of your colleagues. It's like, this didn't just fall out of the sky. You all were duly elected. I couldn't introduce you because of the current circumstances as the senator from, some set of neighborhoods to be determined. But if this reflects the supermajority will, as expressed through the voting system, despite the amount of noise or intensity or arguments made by other people, you, I think, probably have some basis to say, this is what the people of New York said that they wanted. They elected us. We went through at least one election from the time that we started talking about this in 2020. We're going to have another one. Will you feel like your efforts have been ratified if you come back with a supermajority next year?
Well, I think our efforts have been ratified by coming back with a supermajority in 2020, because we had the kitchen sink thrown at us on this issue specifically. But again, I try not to get too worked up about it. This is our process. This is our system. People get to run against our candidates and make whatever argument they think works. We defend what we've done, and the voters have the final say. And so we'll do that again. We've been very successful. We have the largest majority in the history of the New York State Senate right now. And so I think we're doing something right that the voters appreciate in order to kind of get into that place.
Okay. That brings us to the end of our time. Thanks so much for a great conversation.
Thank you, Earl. Thank you, everybody.
We're going to move forward with what has been described as a lightning round. I don't know if that's necessarily the way it's going to feel, because we're going to have so much substance and so many great ideas moving quickly through this room. And we certainly welcome as well everybody watching on the live stream. What we're going to do is have a series of various stakeholders come and share some of their best ideas about where things stand on bail reform and where things need to go. And we'll talk for a few minutes with each of them. And then we believe, if timing works out, we'll have a chance for me to ask some questions and maybe probe a little bit into some of the ideas that they want to bring forward. So we'll follow, I guess, our legislative sort of baseline with some ferment, a lot of different ideas, and then you'll get the factual. In the second plenary, you'll hear more about the sort of the facts and where they're taking us. So, first up, we're going to hear from people on very different sides of this issue, from very different perspectives. First up, though, we're going to hear from Jim Quinn. He's a senior executive district attorney in the Queens District Attorney's Office, or he was for a long time. Under Judge Brown. And he's got some things to tell us from his perspective about where things are. Oh, there he is. Come on up, Jim. Good to see you. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Nice to be here.
Yes. Well,
Nice to be anywhere, actually.
Well, something I've mentioned as I often do on panels is we urge people to talk not necessarily from their professional title or what position they're expected to take, but just as a New Yorker, somebody who's thought about this stuff and has a great deal of expertise, where are we on bail reform, and what are some things that you think needs to happen?
Well, I think, first of all, you're going to hear from me what you're not going to hear from any of the other panelists here in this lightning round. I think bail reform was a terrible mistake. And I think it was based on a bunch of false assumptions. First of all, it was based on the notion that the people on Rikers were there for minor offenses with minor criminal records simply because they couldn't make $500 bail. It's not true. The people who were on Rikers charged with non-violent felony offenses or misdemeanor offenses had an average of 15 prior arrests, 8 of them felonies, 7 of them misdemeanor, and 2 failures to appear. That was the population that was the target of the bail reform. Those were the ones who were going to be released under bail reform. When bail reform was passed in April of 2019, there were 7,800 people on Rikers Island. By January 1st of 2020, that population had been reduced by 2,000 people, all at once. And all the people who were released were almost every drug dealer in New York City, almost every car thief, every burglar, a lot of robbers, anybody charged with grand larceny who was only in on bail. They were all released at once. And what happened, once those people were released, crime in New York City started its rise. As of November of 2019, before those people were released, crime in New York City was down 1.7%. 2.5 months into bail reform, crime in New York City had gone up 20%. And it had gone up in robbery, went up 18%, felony assault went up 10%, burglary. And you got to remember, every person charged with burglary was released from Rikers Island by January 1st of 2020. Burglary went up 26%. Grand larceny, every person charged with grand larceny was released from Rikers Island. Grand larceny went up 15.8%. Auto theft, every person charged with auto theft, auto crime went up 68% in just the first 2.5 months of 2020. And that's after crime declining in almost every one of those categories in all of 2019. The fact of the matter is that bail reform has been a disaster for New York City. I know there's a lot of talk about how it affected violent crime. The crime that really, really got affected in New York City was the nonviolent crime and the petty larcenies and the misdemeanors have just been increasing in New York City because of the people who were released.
And what does that mean for public safety?
It means that more people have their cars stolen, more people have their houses burglarized, more people have their telephones stolen while they're sitting in a restaurant, more people have their kids have their telephones stolen from them on their way to school. It has an enormous impact on public safety. It has an enormous impact on the quality of life in the city. Now, you know, another thing I wanted to get to, I don't know if you're going to ask me the question, but I've only got 5 minutes, so I want to get it all out.
Have you say, absolutely.
There's a lot of talk, in fact, State Senator Cousins says that only 2% of the people who are charged with a crime get rearrested for violent crime in New York State while their case is pending. Now, that is technically true. And there were 284,000 people arrested in the 18 months of the bail reform. And I think it's 5,600 of them were arrested for violent felony. And that is true, and that comes out to about 2%. But what you have to understand is that the people who are impacted by bail reform are the repeat offenders charged with nonviolent crimes. Those are the people who were released. It is not that the person is arrested for shoplifting at a Duane Reade for the first time. Bail was never set on those people. Even the second or third time, bail was never set on those people. People charged with nonviolent felonies very rarely had bail set on them unless they had extensive records or failures to appear. That is a fact. So when you look at the people in New York State who are in what's called non-monetary release, which is, you know, under the bail reform, the state set up a system where a judge, if a judge found that a defendant was likely to not appear, the judge could order him into non-monetary release, which means that the judge would set conditions on his release. It was essentially to replace bail. And if you look at the defendants who were put into non-monetary release, now judges found that they're at risk of flight, and you look at those defendants who had prior convictions or a pending case, those are the people that would have had bail set in 2019. Judges would have set bail on those defendants. The recidivism rate on those defendants charged with burglary in the third degree, which is commercial burglaries, was 70%. Grand larceny, 70%. Robbery in the third degree, 70%. Robbery in the second degree, 46%. Criminal contempt, 65%. Criminal possession of a controlled substance in the seventh degree, 47%. Petty larceny, 79%. 79% of the people put into the non-monetary release program got rearrested while their case was pending. Menacing, 46%. The bottom line is that bail reform, whatever you want to say about the old system, the criminal justice system in the past brought crime down 76% in 27 years. It brought down the population of Rikers Island by 60% during that time. And yet we're constantly told that the criminal justice system was broken and it had to be fixed. This is not a proper fix. It is endangering the people of the state of New York. And the statistics, if you look at them honestly, not, looking for a way to justify your position, but look at them honestly, it shows that the bail reform laws and the people who have been released under them are committing the crimes that are causing the crime rise in New York City.
Okay, before I let you go, because we are out of time, but no, that's fine. But what would be the proposed fix? To talk like a lawyer for a minute, even if everything that you say is true, if the legislature in its judgment and the public, which will put them there, has said, you know what, as awful as the outcome might be, a repeat shoplifter is better than somebody rotting in Rikers Island for $500,000 a year. What would be your answer to them?
Look, first you have to decide what is important for the city. Is it important to keep the streets safe? Is it important to protect people? And if you come down on that side, you have to say that we have to have a system that allows a judge to look at a defendant and look at his record, look at the crime he's charged with, look at the evidence against him, look at his background, and determine this individual is a danger if he's out on the street. And whatever you want to call it a dangerous standard or the risk of reoffending standard or whatever. I am remanding this defendant because he is a danger to society. Mm-hmm. And there's really, if you do that simply, it takes away all the arguments about poor people get kept in jail and rich people get out. It offended me as a prosecutor that Harvey Weinstein was outed, pending his trial.
Sure. I mean, that same standard, do you think would have applied to Harvey Weinstein?
Of course.
Yeah. Okay, very good.
All right.
Thanks a whole lot.
Thank you.
Okay. Okay, our next person is going to be, I think Alice Fontier is next, the Managing Director of the Neighborhood Defender Service of Harlem. Good morning, how are you? Yeah, exactly. How are you?
I'm okay, thank you for having me.
Yes.
Glad to be here.
What do we need to do?
So, I'm trying to reduce my emotional response to what I just heard. In the last 17 months, 20 people have died on Rikers Island. 20 deaths in 17 months. That's pretrial custody. That's pretrial custody in New York City. The boat, the now defunct Tombs, Rikers Island, these facilities, over many years of dysfunction, have become nothing short of a torture chamber, where people are consigned to languish for months, for years, waiting for trial or death. And death comes faster. And many of those 20 people chose their own death rather than sit in pretrial custody in this city. So let's go back and talk about bail reform. The goal of bail reform is now and always has been to reduce the number of people who are held pretrial in this state. By that standard, bail reform has worked and is working. Every time we roll it back a little, it works slower, but it's working. About 10,000 fewer people across the state each year are held in custody pretrial, post-bail reform. 10,000 people a year. 10,000 people who are free to go home to their families, to go to work, to go to school, to seek treatment if that's what's needed. 10,000 people a year who are free to live. And I mean that literally, free to live. Those are the stories we should be hearing. The 30,000 success stories is what we should be talking about. Every single family who had their loved one at home should be on this stage talking about how their lives are stable, how they're succeeding, and how bail reform helped them. But we never hear those stories. We never do. Instead, what we hear are these public safety statistics, which are supposed to be honest. But let's talk honestly, please, let's talk honestly about the facts and the statistics. Prior to bail reform, 95% of people who were awaiting trial did not get rearrested. Post-bail reform, and each year post-bail reform, 96% of people who were awaiting trial did not get rearrested. It is just not true that bail reform had any impact on rearrest rates. It is a false statement. It is a false statement designed to scare you, to raise fear, and it is politics and nothing more. The discussion about bail reform has not been based on any facts, on any data. It is about fear and about scaring you. And most recently, the tropes are about gun violence and an increase in gun violence somehow being related to bail reform. There is just nothing true about it. The bail reform as enacted in 2019, as still in effect now, largely left gun cases untouched. If you are on the street with a loaded firearm, you are going to jail. It was true before bail reform, and it's true now. And what we have seen is that judges are reacting to bail reform and increases in gun violence by setting higher bail. So people who are arrested with a gun are held in custody on bail they cannot afford, and they stay there for months or years until they take a plea or go to trial. That is what is happening. So connecting gun violence to bail reform is false, it is misleading, it is designed to frighten you. It is designed to frighten the legislators. And it worked. I'm sorry, I want to just keep going for one moment.
Sure.
What we have seen is this fear-mongering and scare tactics work. Senator Gianaris is correct. We managed to have a supermajority of Democrats despite this, but people have paid the price. And people are not investing millions of dollars in these scare tactics and fear-mongering because it doesn't work. And in our political cycle, where every legislator is up for re-election every 2 years, it means that they are constantly campaigning. And so the New York Post headlines blaring about crime stats and claiming that it has something to do with bail, let's have an honest discussion. John Jay has put together an incredible group of people today, and what my hope is that the discussion today is honest. It is truthful, it is based on facts. If you are someone who opposes bail reform, if you think it was a terrible idea, I ask you to admit that what you want is for people to be incarcerated pre-trial, and you are not concerned about the deaths on Rikers Island, that you are not concerned that the people who are incarcerated are overwhelmingly Black and brown, and that a dangerousness standards doubles down on the racist impact. I want you to admit that and defend it with facts and not with fear. And that is what I hope for today, is that we have an honest discussion.
Let me just ask you real briefly, if we take as fact, let's put aside the gun crimes, things that I think there's broad consensus, nobody wants to see any of that. If some of the statistics we heard from Jim Quinn are true around, say, auto theft, around shoplifting, around repeat offenders on the misdemeanor side of the scale, and it has enervated the public, the voters, enough that they've gotten the attention of elected officials, including judges. Let's not forget judges are also elected, which is where the dangerous standard will start to sort of feel some of that same political pressure ultimately if it were enacted. What should be done about that?
So it is the crime stats that have gone up. As Senator Gianaris pointed out, across the country, crime has gone up. We talk about in New York bail reform as if that's the thing that did it. It is not true that on the day that bail reform was enacted, 2,000 people walked out of jails across the state and started committing crimes. 2,000 people walked out of Rikers. It's not true. But what is true is that in 2020, a pandemic started and our economy ground to a screeching halt, and people had lost jobs, were stuck into crowded conditions and homes, getting sick and dying. Those things are true and may have an impact on crime rates.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
I'm putting the lightning in the lightning round. Thank you very much.